Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound. We'll have a link in the episode notes for your convenience. Many of the books mentioned here in the podcast are available in Audible. Sign up for a free 30-day membership trial, and you can download any book you like. Support the Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound.
If our two eyes are not working together well as a fast, synchronized team, our internal MapQuest continues to be off. It's consistently inconsistent with our ability to judge time and space. Those that don't feel well grounded, those that have some measure of anxiety, oftentimes it starts in the visual system. If you can't move, look, and listen in a fast, accurate, effortless, sustainable, age-appropriate, meaningful way, you're in a world of hurt. There's a whole world in vision and how it affects brain function that no one's ever shared with you. 2020 is perceived as the holy grail of going to the eye doctor. Well, I'm here to change that paradigm. Welcome back again to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. I am your host, Dr. Doug Stephey. We have a delightful guest today. His name is Dr. Michael Lewis. He is the author of a book called When Brains Collide. This book we're going to talk about today, traumatic brain injuries and omega-3 fatty acids and anything in between all of that. Having said that, Dr. Michael Lewis, thank you for coming.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Doug.
So before we actually launch in, if you would like to, you can either give us a 1-minute version of your history from West Point to now, or you can just say, you know what, I spent 30 years in the military, got out, this is what I'm doing now. But could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, yes. West Point out of high school, 5 years plain Army, as I would call it, before I went to school at Tulane. Every intention to be a surgeon, eventually, doing general practice. The Army sent you out to do general practice for a couple of years. I discovered nights and weekends that surgeons don't know anything about. Ended up going into preventive medicine and public health with a focus on infectious diseases, which in today's world is kind of an interesting throwback. Because my assignment after that was in Asia looking for new and interesting diseases and, happened to come across things like SARS and bird flu. Relevant to today's world. And then they said, you got this great experience coming back and teach medical students in Bethesda. So I did that for quite a number of years. And along the way, got the idea, put 2 and 2 together and came up with an odd number and said to the head of research, is anybody looking at omega-3s from fish oil to help our soldiers recover from traumatic brain injury? And the answer was, no, why don't you? And that was basically a career change. And then when I retired after 31 years, I started a couple of things, a small nonprofit to get more education out there. I do see patients occasionally at my office in Potomac, just outside of Washington, D.C. And just why I say my full-time job's being retired, and I've got about 8 or 9 different projects that keep me busy.
Well, that sounds fantastic. I'm so glad that you wrote this book because it's a critical component, arguably, of brain injuries and brain recovery. And one of the things that we're going to talk about a little while anyway is sports injuries. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you the first slow pitch. And that is, how about you give us just a simple definition of what is a traumatic brain injury?
Well, one of the best ways I like to describe it, I'm a very visual person, which is great when talking to optometrists, I guess. But I always think of the idea of go out to get the morning newspaper and there's black ice and you slip on the ice and your feet go flying, right? Your head hits the pavement. Well, your skull comes to a sudden stop, but your brain doesn't. Your brain, just a fraction of a second behind that, it doesn't stop until it hits something, which is the inside of your skull. And it can reverberate. And if you're lucky, it's just causing a bruising on the brain. Hopefully it's not a massive bleed in the brain that could be life-threatening. But assuming that we're at the concussion level, whether you're banging heads on a football field or heading a soccer ball or slipping down the ice like I described, you get a bruising on the brain that may not even be visible on any kind of imaging. It can be so microscopic, but it doesn't mean that the injury isn't there. And most people think, okay, well, I'm seeing stars like Bugs Bunny or something like that. You shake it off. Okay, you better. Most people don't actually lose consciousness. And they drive on from there, get back in the game, as you will, or just, shake it off and, I got life to deal with and to move on. But that's really just the beginning, because that's what we call the primary injury. The secondary injury or secondary phase, all that primary injury sets off these biochemical cascades. And the one I'm most concerned about is inflammation, really. And that can continue to burn and churn through the brain for minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, even decades. And I'll point out, Muhammad Ali took a few hits to the head as a young man, and you see how he ended up later in life. That was as a result of chronic inflammation, in my opinion, that never got resolved. And that's where I came up with the idea, how do we resolve the inflammation, and the use of omega-3s, the fats that make up the brain in the first place.
Okay, now we're going to circle back to the treatment protocols towards the end of the session today. But one of the things that I really liked in your book, the analogy that you gave about the brain being inside the skull, I like the idea of a brain of jello, right? So it's not solid, right? We got this malleability. And the other thing I really liked about that imagery was when you talked about that there's different densities within the brain. So when the brain does end up coming to a stop by hitting the inside of your skull, it does it at different speeds. And I would imagine different damage based upon those different densities. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So, if you think about what they sometimes call the old brain or the limbic system of the brain, the deep center part of the brain versus what looks kind of like jello on the outside of the brain, the cortex, they're very, very different densities. But so it's the basic physics, it's body in motion is going to stay in motion until acted on by, but also then it's also really basic physics. Like, so something that's more dense is going to slow down or decelerate at a different speed than something that's less dense. And the problem with that is the connections between the different parts. And so it's going to stretch and pull these connections. And that's something we call shearing. And if it's bad enough, we call it diffuse axonal injury. You'll hear about in more severe injuries. And that's literally that shearing between the different parts of the brain, the different connections. So that gets into the whole concept of, neuroplasticity. If you want to talk, we'll make a quick leap towards what do you do about it. The brain, it's kind of like using Waze or Google Maps to navigate to, from LA to San Diego, and there's an accident on the I-5, and, Waze or your mapping software is going to route you around that accident, maybe off the highway, but it's going to find a different way to route. That's neuroplasticity. So that's how the brain tries to, while it's healing itself, it may never heal. It may just reroute the traffic around that because the damage that was done when the different density parts of the brain were disrupted.
One of the things that I liked about the idea of sharing, and I was thinking hard about it this morning before we got on the show, because I'm big on imagery and analogies, as Tim would attest to, my producer. But I was thinking about, if I think about a mozzarella stick, and that is an intact neuron and a collection of neurons that all have to function together in synchrony. Well, I thought, what if I peeled apart the mozzarella stick almost little piece by little piece by little piece, stacked them back together into a unit, and then took my hands on either side of it and just squished them and turned them a little bit. Now all those mozzarella little sticks start to separate or shear apart from each other. And I think the reason that's important to understand is when you spoke in the book about how a CAT scan's not going to show shearing.
Well, a CAT scan is really a surgical tool in the emergency setting. Is there a bleed that I need to take this person into the operating room to deal with this subdural or this bleed on the brain? So that's really the utility of a CAT scan. So it's not going to show that microscopic shearing. Now, if the damage is bad enough, an MRI, 5, 7, 10, 12 days later will potentially show up, will show potential damage from diffuse axonal injury from that shearing. But that doesn't show up right away either. So, why not use an MRI right away? Because it's not going to show anything much more different than a CAT scan. A CAT scan is just a series of rapid X-rays that are then reconstructed in a three-dimensional way by the power of software. Whereas an MRI works very different. It's not X-rays. It's a magnetic resonance imaging. It uses powerful magnets, and it pulls essentially water in different directions, and that is miraculously figured out through the miracle of software. I'm always amazed at how these things, whoever thought of these things is incredible. But it's really about the direction that water turns or moves when placed under a large magnetic force. So very, very different.
And I think one of the points to make for the listening audience is that an MRI more so, and a CAT scan is looking at structure, but not function.
Well, an MRI is only looking at structure too. Now, there are different ways that people, not in your typical hospital setting, but there are different ways, diffuser tensor imaging and functional MRIs and things like that are used in more of a research setting, and they're incredibly expensive, and they're really only used for research. They're not really practical to use in your community hospital emergency medicine setting.
So we've got a good definition of what a traumatic brain injury is. Are they common?
Unfortunately, they're incredibly common. And, if we look at just big numbers, numbers from the CDC, for example, which keep in mind, they only capture numbers that enter into the medical system, does not include private practice type of practices. It's like emergency medicine, hospital-based medicine. And so it's only capturing numbers. So somewhere in there, we guess between probably 2.5 to 5 million people have concussions or brain injuries every year. And of those, a certain number, roughly 50,000 people die of their head injuries. Probably the biggest two things are falls, slipping and falling or that type of thing, and car accidents. There's X number, 100,000 hospitalizations. And then there's community-based surveys that give us an idea of how many concussions there are out there. But there's probably 3 to 5 million concussions every single year. And you got to remember, we got 44 million kids playing organized sports every year as well.
Now, just to go back to the 3 to 5 million or so, is that reported and unreported both, or just the reported numbers?
Well, the reporteds are going to be about 1.5 million. And so from that, in different ways of doing epidemiologic and population-based studies, we can estimate that there's probably close to 3 to 5 million injuries that occur every year.
All right. So how about age distribution?
The young and the old. That's the principal thing. So for similar but yet different reasons. So if you think about a toddler who's just learning to walk, and you think about the size of their head and their muscle coordination, right? Their neck strength hasn't developed. Obviously, their head in relative size to their body is much larger. And so the young are actually quite at risk. And of course, as you get up into the 4, 5, 6 years old range, they've learned how to ride bikes and skateboard and on the playground, stuff like that. And yet they still haven't developed that neuromuscular control. Up into the teenage years where they have developed, essentially for the most part an adult-sized body, but they're hopefully being active outside, playing sports and riding bikes and driving cars now and things. So and plus the frontal lobe hasn't really developed completely to where decision making is not the strong strength of teenagers, as we know. Then we'll fast forward to older age. It's neuromuscular control, but it's on the other end. We're losing neuromuscular control. We're losing muscle mass as we get older. and we're more prone to falls. So it's really the young, really up through the teenage, early 20s, and then the older population. I'll let you define that if you want.
It keeps changing on me. So the teen years, we've got neuromuscular control, but arguably we don't have very good frontal lobe control, so we don't make very good decisions, which brings us to the boys versus girls dilemma. So I'm just guessing that there's maybe a higher prevalence of traumatic brain injuries in boys because we do stupid things, but yet girls aren't out of the woods either, because when they do suffer a brain injury, they seem to not recover as well or suffer more consequences. Did I get that right?
I think that's a pretty good characterization. I'm not going to correct you on that. I'll just expand on that. Yes, there are more concussions amongst the male persuasion, but in my experience, and science certainly bears this out, that girls do tend to have a tougher time recovering from it. That said, everybody wants to point towards tackle football, but at the high school level and even into the college level, girls soccer actually has almost as many concussions as boys football, and probably more, on a population level. If you just look at numbers, there's probably more girls playing soccer than there are boys playing football. So the numbers are probably about the same, but as far as rates, almost. But that doesn't put girls out of the woods just from soccer. But girls ice hockey is a huge problem with concussions, but there aren't that many girls that play ice hockey. Equestrian sports, may not have as many concussions, but they can be absolutely devastating, just like cheerleading. May not have that many concussions, but when they happen, they can be very devastating. So girls are definitely not out of the woods. And there's a couple of reasons, and I'll just throw two of them out really quick. One is girls' neck strength tends to not be the same as their male counterparts. And there's studies, I think, out of either New Zealand or Australia with girl rugby players that do specific neck strengthening exercises, and that decrease the risk of concussions. So it's really, neck strength is a big issue with girls, but also their menstrual cycle. And we now know that it's the end of the menstrual cycle, the last 5 days before they start to menstruate, and the first 2 days that they're menstruating. So it's really the end of the cycle, that if girls that have a concussion during that week period, the last week of their menstrual cycle, are at much greater risk of having issues than if they're in the middle of their cycle. And that's all due to the protective effects of hormones and the ebb and flow of them, of course.
All right, so let's get back to the brief physiology of this inflammatory cascade, because that's going to be our segue into having a discussion about omega fatty acids and omega-6s and omega-3s. So can you walk us through that cascade again?
Well, when you damage any part of the body, the reaction is inflammation. If I punch in the shoulder hard enough and you get a little bit of bruising there, right? It's because the blood vessels have maybe at the capillary level have been disrupted. And so you get some bleeding outside of the blood vessel, the vasculature, and you need inflammation. Inflammation absolutely inflammation is life. You need it. And you've got to be able to get all the cells in there to start cleaning up. You got to get the platelets in there to stop the bleeding, of course. And then you got to get the white blood cells in there to start cleaning up, and all the other chemical mediators that are involved in inflammation. So you got to get that in there to start the repair process. But you also have to be able to resolve the inflammation. You have to be able to turn that process off. And that's where we run into problems, and when we can start talking about omega-6s and omega-3s.
Yep. So let's do that. Let's move on into polyunsaturated fatty acids that mostly seem to tie into omega-6s and omega-3s.
So omega-6s, the downstream effect of omega-6s are pro-inflammatory. They help provide the substrates to help the inflammation. So omega-6s are the feeding aspect of inflammation. So they help feed the inflammation. as well as help blood clot. And so omega-6s, as you imagine, are incredibly important and a major part of our brain and every cell in our body. But we've got to be able to balance those, and nature did actually provide a great balance. So omega-6s, while they're promoting inflammation, omega-3s help resolve the inflammation. And sometimes we call it, anti-inflammatory, but it's really about resolving the inflammation. And so nature intended for omega-6s and omega-3s to be balanced. In fact, the enzyme processes that are involved in making omega-6s and omega-3s and breaking them down and everything, all those enzymes are shared between the two because we're meant to be in balance. And for the millennia, they were in balance. How we ate and what nature provided us was a great balance. But about 100 years or so ago, really the Industrial Revolution, but then it really accelerated in the 20th century and then really super accelerated after starting around 1970 or so. The amount of omega-6s in the food supply just went up, between, say, 1950 and 1980, 1990 or so. The amount of omega-6s consumed in the United States went up about 16-fold and went from about 1% of the energy intake to over 6, probably 8, maybe even higher. I haven't seen any measurements in the last 20 years, but let's say it's 8 to 10% of our energy comes from omega-6s. Well, the enzyme processes that I said are shared get saturated at about 4%. So if we're at double or even triple that, it's not a fair fight anymore. And subsequently, we have ratios of omega-6s to omega-3s. If we were to test the next 100 people walking by in the street, which would take a while now since nobody's walking down the street, if they're not taking any kind of supplementation, their ratios are going to be roughly 20 or even 30 to 1 out of balance with the pro-inflammatory omega-6s to the resolving omega-3s. So 20 to 30 to 1 out of balance. So it's no longer a fair fight. And that's just a setup for chronic inflammation. It's literally, we're eating ourselves to death with chronic inflammation and omega-6s. Where are they? They're in everything. Omega-6s as a molecule are very shelf stable, which is why they're used to process food. So any food that has been processed has omega-6s in it, principally from soybean oil, which is the most common oil used, not just for processing, but it's in everything. It's what we use to fry our foods. It's because it's stable. You put a box of crackers out in the sun for 3 days, probably no big deal. You put a piece of fish out in the sun for an hour, you probably don't want to eat it because omega-3s spoil very quickly. So we can't use them to process. And if we want to make food and ship it around the world, we're going to be using omega-6s to do that. So you kind of get the idea that it's really about the balance. So eliminating omega-6s from our diet is a good step, but it's fat. So it's going to take months, years, if you can even do it, because it's ubiquitous. It's what we feed our chickens and our pigs and our cows, so it's throughout the food supply, throughout the food chain. Whereas omega-3s are principally found in leafy green vegetables, but those are the short chain that don't get made to the long chain because of that imbalance. So the best source of omega-3s is really seafood. And we suck as a culture and a society in our seafood intake. Leading researchers really say, we have an omega-3 problem, but what we really have is we have a way overabundance of omega-6s. We have an omega-6 problem.
One of the things that popped into my mind as you were talking about that omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, I picture myself in a rowboat with a hole in the bottom. Right. So the water coming in is inflammation, and that's too much omega-6s, right? Mm-hmm. If I've got a 5-gallon bucket, I can pitch that water out at a rate to balance out the rate that it's coming in. But if I've got way too many omega-6s, maybe a bigger hole, and not enough omega-3s, I imagine myself trying to bail the boat out with an espresso cup. And that's just never going to balance out. And so the pro-inflammatory systems are going to contribute to that chronic inflammation. And it's just going to continue to smolder until we lower the amount of omega-6s or raise the amount of omega-3s, which gets us back to this idea that there is a ratio, which that's a nice branch that we can go over now and talk about. Can we actually measure omega-6 and omega-3 ratios through a blood test?
We can. There's a couple of small companies out there that will do it, but also the big companies like LabCorp and Quest can do it in what they call a fatty acid panel or a fatty acid analysis. And so what it's going to tell you is all the different fats in your blood. And the small companies will tell you this as well. But there's a couple of key ratios, a couple of key markers in there, because if you really look at it, you get 5 pages worth of data. And you're like, what the heck do I do with all this? So there's a couple of easy ones. The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. That's an easy one. It's probably going to be 20, 30 to 1. It should be, 3 to 1 is great. 5 to 1 is pretty good. Anything on, 8 to 1 is not terrible. But closer to 1 to 1 that we get, which is not necessarily realistic in today's society. But if you can get the 3 to 5 to 1, that's great. EPA or arachidonic acid, or AA, to EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid. Arachidonic acid is omega-6. EPA is one of the omega-3s. So that's kind of a more of an inflammation marker, and that's a ratio as well. And that's one you should get the 3 to 5 to 1 as well. So the AA to EPA ratio, as we call it. And then there's an omega-6 index, there's an omega-3 index, and it's a zero-sum game because we're looking at percentages. So the higher the omega-6 index, the lower the omega-3 index is going to be, and vice versa. And so really the one that's probably becoming a little bit more standard to look at, if you want a single number to look at, would be the omega-3 index. So an omega-3 index of 8 is really pretty good. And studies that I've done in the military, we basically had an omega-3 index of around 1.7. Oh. Less than 4 is really a major risk factor for heart disease, actually. I'll just, I'll literally jump almost to the end and say, I don't take a ton of fish oil on a daily basis. I just do it consistently. I take 3 capsules of fish oil every day. My omega-3 index is 16. So twice of what is recommended, and that's just taking 3 capsules a day.
I want to step in for just a second because I think we got to make a really good clarifying point. Your AA to EPA ratio is not 16 to 1 because that would be ridiculously inflammatory. Your 16 to 1 is the percentage of the makeup of your cell membranes are made up of omega-3s.
Correct.
I just want to make sure that the audience is really distinguishing the percentage of your cell membranes that are made up by omega-3s versus the AA to EPA ratio.
Right. And so the average American is going to be somewhere between 2 and maybe 4. 8 is considered healthy, and I run around 15, 16.
So now let's get to some of the nitty-gritty. This was wonderful, by the way. I think it's clarifying, it's simple, everybody can understand it. So I love the discussion that we're having. And then let's go on and talk about the omega-3 protocol that you've created some years ago, and talk about the dosing and how we sort of measure outcomes, both on the immediate outcome of having a TBI and maybe decades later.
Well, you bring up about 5 different things in that one sentence, really. So I'll see if I can hit them really quick, and then we can dig into it a little bit. One of the questions I always get is, well, I had a concussion 8 years ago. Will it help me now? Yes. Short answer. I've dealt with Hall of Fame football players that are 60, 70 years old. So they haven't played football in 40 years. It can help them. But when is it best? This is sort of a 2-answer question, a single question. When is it best to start taking your fish oil? As soon as possible after a concussion. I mean, as soon as possible, which drove some of my initial research. Well, how soon is possible? Well, how about before the concussion is even better. Exactly. So that's sort of 2 answers to the same question: is when should you start taking fish oil for concussion? as soon as possible after, if not before.
Makes sense that everybody should do this blood test and know what the ratios are, because like we know in America, it's 15, 20, 25 to 1 on that AA to EPA ratio. So everybody should know their numbers, because in this case, numbers don't lie.
I've actually, in my clinical practice, I don't even bother doing numbers anymore on people initially, because I know they're all deficient. It's not going to change how I'm going to approach the treatment or the problem, and save the patient a little bit of money, because I already know the answer. If I already know the answer, why do the test? They're deficient, because everybody is. That's not necessarily the right answer. The best answer is that you should, if you want to know, you really should do it with objective data, and that can be done from a blood test. That's the best answer. And
that's a really good starting point too, because then we get into the question of, well, how much should you be taking, right? So yes, I think it would be an easy recommendation to say everybody should be taking 3,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA combined on a daily basis. That's a reasonably true statement. But if you've got a AA to EPA ratio, it's 15 to 1, 21, 31, 50 to 1, that level of dosing probably should be higher, I would think, to get your numbers down faster.
Well, is it about getting your numbers down faster, or is it about getting your numbers down? That's those are two different thoughts. So with typical supplementation, if I were to give somebody, 1,000 milligrams a day, we know that it really takes about 3 months, 12 weeks to reach sort of a steady state level. I just looked at, 3 months. If somebody is struggling with the issues of brain health, whether it's from a concussion or mental health issues and so on, do I really want to take a 12-week approach? Or do I want to take a 6-week or a 3-week or a 1-week approach? So that's part of the reason why I started to look at a loading dose can we shorten that period? And so there are some case reports out there in the literature, that one in particular that showed, which influenced my thinking, when somebody who was in a coma was being given for carbon monoxide poisoning and brain damage from the carbon monoxide poisoning. They were given pretty large doses of fish oil down their feeding tube. He was in a coma. And they were measuring the blood levels, and they showed that it still took 3 or 4 weeks to reach the optimal levels of where their AA to EPA or omega-6 to omega-3 ratio. And that was with massive doses down the feeding tube. And it still took 4 weeks. So if somebody's struggling with the issues of brain health, I want to try to help them out as quickly as possible. I'm not a big fan of the low and slow approach. I want to help people quicker, and that's why I came up with some of the numbers that I did.
And one of the things that I'm going to tell the listening audience is that we're going to put the link to Dr. Lewis's nonprofit, and you can find the written omega-3 protocol as a document on the website, so that you can go read about it in more detail, because we are running out of time and we'll have to wrap things up in another minute or so. So yes, we'll put some information at the end of the show notes. I also want to come back to the idea of that loading dose, right? Because it's big in your omega-3 protocol, but it's also been proven to be really effective. And for people, whether it's in a feeding tube or again years later, what I want folks to know is that there is information out here. Dr. Lewis has done a masterful job of putting it all together in one place, and I think that's fantastic. One of the things that I also want the audience to also appreciate is when we're talking about an omega-3 protocol, and we're talking about EPA and DHA as the component of fish oil that we want you to take. So, for example, when Dr. Lewis said he takes 3,000 milligrams a day, he's taking 3,000 milligrams of EPA and DHA, which is a completely different discussion than 3,000 milligrams of fish oil. So if you're taking a fish oil product, whether it's in pills or liquid form, you've got to look at the EPA, DHA content of that bottle and know what you're really getting per dose, not just the fish oil. Because I remember an older gal, probably in her 70s, a number of years ago, we were having this omega-3 discussion just about general aging brain health. And she says, well, I'm taking omega-3s now. And I said, well, what are you taking? I don't remember. Okay, how many do you take a day? I take 2. I'm like, go home and text me a picture of your bottle, and I'm going to calculate your EPA and DHA that's in that product. And then we're going to take that number and divide it into 3,000 just as a generally recognized as safe amount. She would have had to taking 70 pills a day of the product that she was using. So you pretty much have to have a PhD in fish oil to figure all this out, so that we want you to do the right things, but we want you to do the right things correctly. And I think that Dr. Lewis's website will help you understand that in greater detail. And I'll put some other things at the end of the show notes as well. Does that sound like a reasonable statement, Dr. Lewis?
It does. And it's, the idea of going to a big box store and getting, a 5-gallon jug of fish oil for $3, you're probably going to get what you pay for, and it's not going to be good. In fact, not only not going to have a lot of omega-3s in it, but it's potentially just a bad product that may actually be more harmful. You get what you pay for, get good quality, look up who are the best, top 5 brands, and they're top 5 for a reason. And so more concentrated is going to cost more, but it's going to save you, like in the amount of capsules that you would be taking on a daily basis.
And because you've been looking at the omega-3 industry for quite a while now, I do have a question that you may or may not know the answer to. I've always been intrigued when I look at an omega-3 supplement, and I'm specifically looking for the EPA, DHA content. And frequently when I look at that section on the label, there's no numbers. There's either tiny little daggers or there's just asterisks. Do you know what the industry standard is for what those mean?
I'm not sure there is an industry standard for that. And it is absolutely confusing because they may say a dose has X amount of EPA and DHA, but what's the dose? That dose might be 2 or 3 or 5 capsules. So You don't know necessarily, then you got to do a little bit more math and figure out how much per capsule. And so, they don't make it easy for us, do they?
No, they do not at all. And then, Dr. Lewis, before you go, I do have a question that, again, you may or may not know the answer to, but I think in one of the emails that I sent you, I know this local group, this brain injury support group, and founder of that group was in almost a fatal car accident 20-some years ago and has anterior grade amnesia. You wouldn't really know it when you met her and talked to her, but there it is. And then about 5 or 7 years after that, she was in another car accident, had a different head injury, and she knows a lot of other people that had a head injury. She says, Doug, I'm telling you, it's common for us to really suffer with changes in barometric pressure. And I wanted to know if you've heard that before. 2, what's really the cause of it? And probably 3, is there anything that can be done about it? Or is their brains just so damaged that that's just going to be part of their life?
We think about the bones that surround the brain, and we always think about the 2 big ones on the left and the right side that you put your hands on your head. That's what you're touching. Of course, you got a third one in the back, but what's underneath? What's on the bottom of the brain? There's like 18 different bones that sit between your brain and your sinuses. There's a lot of stuff jammed into the space of a head. So those 18 or so bones at the base of the brain are generally small and generally can be, with a head injury, can be pushed out of place and affect sinuses. It can affect sense of smell, can affect so many different things. And so, if you're affecting the sinuses, and the barometric pressure then is going to potentially have an impact on things. So absolutely what she's saying from an anatomical point of view makes perfect good sense. So how do you deal with that anatomical abnormality that was caused by a head injury? I'm actually going to go back to a chiropractic approach where we're not adjusting your neck or your back, and I'm not a chiropractor, but apparently there's this old technique from back in the 1920s or 30s from the Pacific Northwest. And somebody kind of picked up on it and started using it for traumatic brain injury. And she's been wildly successful with it, in my opinion. And I've used it on a couple of patients and just flabbergasted at how it can help people. You can look that up at nasalreleasetechnique.com. And Cindy Stein is a physical therapist who's really kind of re-pioneered it, because she didn't pioneer it. She's just sort of revived it. And it's really fantastic. It's a kind of this old chiropractic way of adjusting the bones in the middle of your face, in the middle of your head, through some not so gentle techniques, but it can help.
Having said all that, Dr. Lewis, I want to thank you again. This has been a delight to have you come on this morning. I reread your book twice, and it's fantastic. And I'm going to put the title of the book at the end of the show notes so people know how to find that as well. Thank you again. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Oh, thanks, Doug. It's great to be able to get this information out, and hopefully we help some people.
Thank you for listening to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast with Dr. Doug Stephey. All of the resources mentioned in this podcast and links to learn more about our guest can be found in the episode notes from whichever podcast app you might be listening with. You'll also find a link to Dr. Stephey's website, which is stepheyoptometry.com. That's STEPHEY optometry.com. You can also call the office at 626-332-4510. We'd like to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor, Audible. If you love podcasts, you'll love listening to audiobooks with Audible. Many of the books mentioned here in the podcast can also be found at Audible. Dr. Stephey has a free audiobook waiting for you as a gift just for listening to the Move, Look, and Listen podcast. Simply click the link in the show notes to audibletrial.com/inbound. Sign up for a free 30-day membership trial, and you can download any audiobook you like. And if for any reason and at any time you choose to cancel your membership, you get to keep all of your audiobook downloads. It's risk-free and for free for 30 days. Support the Move, Look, and Listen podcast by visiting audibletrial.com/inbound. We really do appreciate you listening. And until next time, for Dr. Stephey of the Move, Look, and Listen podcast, I'm Tim Edwards with the Inbound Podcasting Network.